All right, I want to look at one more example before I ask you to try some problems on your own. And the reason is because I want to be able to view sequences in more than one way and sort of conceptualize them in more than one way, because sometimes viewing them as a list of numbers is helpful, sometimes viewing them as the formula that we just talked about is helpful, or sometimes viewing them graphically is helpful. And we want to be able to switch between these different representations. And so as an example, let's try and sketch this formula. A sub n is equal to 1 plus 1 over 4 to the n. And so you'll see that sketching a formula like this is not very different from sketching a function. And so I'm going to draw two different axes, just like I normally would for an x-axis and a y-axis for a function, except that in this case, because it's a sequence, one of my axes is going to be n, and then the other axis is going to be a sub n. And so now I'm going to label the n values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And now I just want to draw the sequence. And so here I'm going to label a1 just because it will be helpful. And now I want to plug in the different n values for this sequence. And so when I plug in n equals 1 into this formula, 1 plus 1 over 4 to the n, then you can see I get a 1 plus 1/4, or in other words, 5/4, which is probably somewhere like this. And then if I plug in an n equals 2, then I get 1 plus 1 over 4 squared, or in other words, 1 plus 1/16, or in other words, 17/16. And then if I plug in n equals 3, then I'm going to get something that's even closer to 1. And then if I plug in 4, it's going to get even closer and closer and closer to 1, to the point where it's going to be really hard to see the difference between 1 and the actual value of whatever this sequence is. Right? And so we can already see that this sequence is tending towards 1 just from this visual representation, which is something that we're going to talk about more later today. But for now, the key point is to recognize that this sequence, when we draw it, it's just a list of dots right here. And each one of these dots just corresponds to one term in my sequence, or in other words, one number. And so we're not exactly drawing functions like we did before. Instead, we're just drawing these dot plots where we have points for each term in our sequence.